October 1942, Station 105, Chelston Airfield, England. Inside a crowded surgical tent, another injured navigator was brought in as Colonel Malcolm Cummings Grow leaned over the operating table, his hands moving with precision to extract shards of German flak from the young man's chest cavity. The jagged metal had sliced through the airman's leather jacket as effortlessly as a knife through paper. Gross' mind registered what his eyes had witnessed countless times in recent weeks. The trajectory showed low velocity. The wound pattern revealed that the fragments had lost most of their force before impact. If only anything, had stood between this man's skin and the flying shrapnel that tore into his bomber. Beyond the tent walls, Grow could hear another B-17 touching down, its engines sputtering after the grueling flight back across the channel from another daylight bombing run into Hitler's Germany. In the distance, the rumble of approaching ambulances grew louder. The numbers were becoming intolerable. Nearly 70% of the casualties flooding his field hospital bore the same wound characteristics. Injuries from slower-moving fragments, flak splinters and torn pieces of aircraft hurled through the air after anti-aircraft shells exploded around bombers flying at 20,000 feet. Inside those confined fuselages, bits of metal transformed into deadly projectiles. The young navigator would survive. Others that day would not. As the surgeon stepped away from the table, he made a choice that would ultimately alter the statistics of aerial warfare. These wounds didn't have to happen. The means to prevent them already existed and had for centuries. All it required was the right question asked in the right place. Within months, that question would begin saving lives, thousands, eventually. The disaster-facing unprotected bomber crews had started on August 17, 1942. When the 97th Bomb Group launched the first American heavy bomber mission of the war. 18 B-17 Flying Fortresses crossed the English Channel to strike the marshalling yards at Rouen-Sotteville in occupied France. Major Paul Tibbets led 12 bombers to the primary target, while 6 others carried out a diversionary mission. Every aircraft returned unharmed, but the mild resistance near the French coast gave a false impression. As the 8th Air Force pushed deeper into German-occupied territory through the fall and winter of 1942, casualty numbers began painting a grim picture that challenged every assumption about daylight precision bombing. By October 1942, medical officers had compiled the first thorough analysis of 8th Air Force combat injuries. They gathered data from every wounded airman treated in British hospitals. The results stunned military planners who had assumed that enemy fighters posed the main danger. Instead, the findings showed that roughly 70% of all wounds came from relatively slow-moving fragments, not bullets fired by Focke-Wulf 190s or Messerschmitt 109s, but pieces of exploding anti-aircraft shells and fragments of the bombers themselves torn apart by flak bursts. The flak threat over occupied Europe was far beyond what American strategists had predicted. German anti-aircraft defenses, known as Flugabwehrkanonen or flak, had been refined through years of warfare. By late 1942, the Luftwaffe had deployed thousands of guns around key targets. The standard 88mm flak cannon could reach altitudes over 30,000 feet, its time-fused shells detonating at precise heights, sending hundreds of razor-edged fragments hurtling through the air at lethal speeds. Colonel Grow immediately grasped the medical implications. The October casualty study revealed that torso wounds made up the majority of fatal injuries. Chest wounds accounted for 36% of deaths among unarmored crews, while abdominal injuries added another 39%. Together, wounds to the body's core represented 75% of bomber crew fatalities. The math was simple: protect the torso, save lives. But finding a practical solution was not. In 1942, the U.S. Army Air Forces had no body armor program. The idea of personal armor had fallen out of favor during World War I, when heavy steel vests proved too cumbersome for soldiers who needed mobility more than protection. But aerial warfare presented a different problem. Bomber crews already wore oxygen systems, parachutes, and heavy flight suits. They worked in tight compartments where movement was limited and survival, not agility, was what mattered. Their primary threat came from slower fragments, not high-velocity bullets. Gross' surgical background gave him an insight military planners lacked. He understood wound ballistics. A fragment from a flak shell, after traveling 200 yards from its explosion to an aircraft, had already lost most of its initial speed. A projectile moving at 500 to 1,000 feet per second could be stopped by a relatively thin sheet of steel. The same was true for fragments of the aircraft itself. These were not armor-piercing rounds traveling at 3,000 feet per second, but tumbling metal scraps that had already spent much of their energy. In October 1942, Gross submitted a proposal to 8th Air Force Headquarters requesting permission to develop personal armor for bomber crews. His submission referenced the casualty data and included rough sketches of a vest lined with overlapping steel plates sewn into fabric, a design inspired by medieval brigandine armor, which used small, overlapping metal pieces for both flexibility and protection. The initial reaction from Air Force leadership was doubtful. Weight was the first concern. Bomber crews already carried about 40 pounds of gear, parachutes, oxygen tanks, flight suits, and the idea of adding more seemed unrealistic. Cost, manufacturing capacity, and crew willingness were also questioned. Some officers argued that investing in better fighter escorts would be a more effective way to reduce losses. But Gross refused to give up. He suggested a limited trial. Produce a small number of armor vests, issue them to select crews, and compare casualty rates to those without armor. Let the results speak for themselves. Headquarters approved the experiment with one condition. The armor had to be developed quickly and produced outside normal Army supply chains. At that moment, the U.S. had no domestic capacity for rapid armor production. Gross turned to the British for help. The Royal Air Force had previously experimented with body armor for their own bomber crews but had run into difficulties. British bombers, especially the Avro Lancaster, the mainstay of RAF Bomber Command, had extremely cramped interiors. The limited space made wearing bulky armor nearly impossible. By late 1942, the RAF had abandoned these early attempts as unsuitable for their aircraft designs. However, American bombers provided slightly more interior room. The B-17 and B-24, while hardly spacious by any civilian measure, still offered more working area than the Lancaster. What hadn't worked for the RAF might still succeed for the Americans. The British soon connected Colonel Gross with the Wilkinson Sword Company, a manufacturer with a fascinating history in arms and armor. Established in 1772, Wilkinson had built its reputation producing swords, bayonets, and later safety razors. Yet the company had also maintained expertise in metalworking and armor fabrication, tracing back to the Victorian era when it had made bullet-resistant vests for British officers during colonial campaigns. During World War I, Wilkinson had again produced body armor for officers, though the equipment's heavy weight had limited its popularity. By World War II, the firm had shifted most of its work to aircraft fire suppression systems, but it still retained both the facilities and the metallurgical knowledge required to handle armor-grade steel. In October 1942, Gross traveled to Wilkinson's factory with his sketches and the medical data from his field hospital. The collaboration that followed would become a unique partnership between military medicine and private industry. Gross contributed his deep understanding of wound ballistics and human anatomy, while Wilkinson offered its craftsmanship in metalwork and design engineering. Together, they refined the armor concept through numerous iterations, carefully balancing three factors: protection, flexibility, and weight. The final prototype consisted of three separate components: a main vest protecting the chest and back, a detachable apron covering the lower abdomen and groin, and an optional additional piece for specific crew positions such as the ball turret gunner, who faced unique threat angles. Each section was made of 2-inch square plates of manganese steel, about 1 millimeter thick, slightly overlapping and sewn into pockets within a heavy canvas outer shell lined with soft cotton for comfort. The choice of manganese steel was crucial. It was strong enough to stop or deflect the lower velocity fragments that injured airmen but light enough to keep total weight manageable. Each individual plate weighed only a few ounces, yet collectively they covered the torso's vital organs effectively. The full vest and apron combination weighed around 22 pounds, substantial, but acceptable considering the protection it offered. To address concerns about emergency situations, the armor featured a quick-release system made up of color-coded cords and fasteners. By pulling a red ripcord, a crew member could instantly discard the vest, critical in case of bailout or escape from a damaged bomber. By early 1943, Wilkinson Sword had completed several prototype armor suits ready for testing. Trials began in March 1943, with selected bomber crews issued the British-manufactured vests. Early mission reports were encouraging. Soon, wounded crewmen began arriving at field hospitals wearing damaged vests that had clearly saved their lives. Medical officers examined these vests and discovered flak fragments lodged in the metal plates, proof that the armor had stopped them before they could penetrate fully. The fragments had lost just enough speed traveling from the flak bursts to the aircraft for the thin manganese steel to be effective. By spring 1943, word had spread across 8th Air Force bases throughout England. Crews who had seen the results firsthand began requesting the new protective gear. But a new problem quickly emerged. Demand was outpacing supply. Wilkinson Sword's factory capacity was already committed to other wartime production priorities. At best, the company could manufacture about 100 armor suits per month, nowhere near enough to equip the thousands of bomber crewmen in the rapidly expanding 8th Air Force. Recognizing the growing urgency, Colonel Grow began working to bring production to the United States. During the summer of 1943, the U.S. War Department authorized domestic manufacturing of the new armor design. The contract that followed was unconventional. It combined military arsenals and civilian industry in an extraordinary partnership, one that even included the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. The Metropolitan Museum of Art's involvement in the armor program was as unexpected as it was effective. The museum's Department of Arms and Armor housed expert craftsmen and historians who had spent their careers studying and restoring centuries-old suits of armor. Now, under wartime urgency, these same specialists would help design life-saving equipment for bomber crews. Stephen Granksay, curator of the museum's Arms and Armor Department, led the American research effort. His 1945 article in the Metropolitan Museum of Art Bulletin later described the unique collaboration in detail. The design of Armor Vest M6, the latest standardized flyer's armor, was based on one of the museum's brigandines dating from around 1400. The armor exhibits are constantly examined for ideas, and no type that offers even the slightest promise of adaptation is ignored. The museum's team carefully studied heavy tournament armor, lighter battlefield armor, mail shirts, scale armor, and quilted jackets from the Renaissance period, searching for structural principles that could be translated into modern materials. Their task was to merge medieval design concepts with 20th century manufacturing. This partnership between museum artisans and military engineers was one of the most unusual collaborations of the entire war. Craftsmen who normally handled priceless historical relics were now helping to create protective gear for airmen. Centuries of accumulated knowledge in armor construction suddenly found new relevance in the modern era of aerial combat. American production began in mid-1943, with multiple facilities manufacturing variations of the British-inspired design. The standardized version, known as the M1 vest, introduced several key improvements. The outer shell was made of nylon instead of canvas, providing better water resistance and greater durability, while the soft cotton inner lining was retained for comfort. The manganese steel plates remained identical to those used in the Wilkinson Sword prototypes. As the manufacturing network expanded across the United States, output increased rapidly. By October 5, 1943, the M1 Flyers vest was officially approved as standard equipment for all 8th Air Force bomber crews. The authorization order specified that every combat crew member, regardless of role, was to be issued armor suited to their position within the aircraft. This decision created a massive logistical challenge. The 8th Air Force was expanding at an extraordinary rate during the fall of 1943, with new bomb groups arriving in England every month. Each group required hundreds of armor suits. The American-made M1 vest weighed approximately 17 pounds and 6 ounces, lighter than the original British model thanks to refined plate arrangements and improved materials. Several specialized variants were also developed for specific crew roles. M2 vests for pilots and co-pilots, with reduced rear coverage since their seats were already armored from below. M3 aprons for ball turret gunners, designed to fit their tight compartments. M4 aprons for waist gunners who fought standing up. M5 groin protectors for bombardiers, navigators, and other seated personnel, supplementing the main vest. The modular system allowed crews to tailor their protection based on their specific threat exposures. Initially, some airmen resisted the idea of wearing extra weight in combat. But once they saw how effectively the armor stopped shrapnel, skepticism vanished almost overnight. By early 1944, the armor program expanded further, incorporating additional protective gear. The M3 helmet, designed specifically for bomber crews, offered superior defense against flak fragments compared to standard infantry helmets. Built from overlapping manganese steel strips mounted over a leather flying helmet, it could stop pieces of shrapnel that would easily pierce conventional headgear. Nicknamed the Grow helmet after its inventor, this design featured 5 interlocking steel bands that significantly increased head protection without sacrificing comfort or communication capability. 8th Air Force medical officers soon began compiling detailed casualty data comparing armored and unarmored crews. The results were astonishing. A comprehensive study analyzing 1,117 combat casualties from heavy bombardment groups revealed that among airmen without body armor, chest wounds accounted for 36% of deaths and abdominal wounds for 39%. Among armored crews, those numbers dropped dramatically to 8% and 7%, respectively. This represented a 77.1% reduction in fatal chest wounds and an 82.1% reduction in fatal abdominal wounds. Additional analysis found an overall 58% decrease in the number of individuals wounded and a 60% reduction in total wounds after the introduction of armor. The armor wasn't perfect, it couldn't prevent all deaths. Head injuries remained lethal regardless of torso protection, and limb wounds still caused casualties. Fragments striking at steep angles could sometimes find gaps, and direct hits from large-caliber rounds could penetrate the steel plates. But in its main purpose, protecting against slower-moving fragments, the armor was a clear success. By late 1943, the use of body armor had become widespread across the 8th Air Force. The gear's effectiveness would soon be tested during one of the most catastrophic missions in U.S. air combat history, the second raid on Schweinfurt, Germany, on October 14, 1943, a day forever remembered as Black Thursday. That morning, 291 B-17 bombers took off from their bases in England. Their target, the ball-bearing factories of Schweinfurt, vital to the German war machine. No long-range escort fighters were available for most of the mission, leaving the bombers exposed to relentless Luftwaffe attacks. For over 2.5 hours, German fighters tore through the formations. Flak batteries opened fire as the bombers reached their target, filling the sky with explosions. When the surviving aircraft finally limped home, 60 bombers had been shot down outright, and more than 600 crewmen were dead, missing, or captured. Among those who survived, medical reports revealed something remarkable. Many had been saved by gross new body armor. Field hospitals across England documented airmen returning with vests shredded by fragments that would have otherwise torn into their chests or abdomens. In many cases, the steel plates were dented or punctured, but the wounds beneath were minor or entirely prevented. These early results silenced any lingering doubts about the armor's necessity. Crews began refusing to fly missions without it. Mechanics and gunners often scrounged for extra sets, modifying them to fit, or even trading rations to obtain one. By early 1944, production had ramped up enough for the 8th Air Force to issue armor as standard flight equipment for every bomber crew member. The gear soon spread beyond the 8th to the 9th and 15th Air Forces, as well as the Royal Air Force Bomber Command, which revisited its earlier decision to abandon armor once it saw the American results. As the war continued into 1944 and 1945, body armor designs evolved further. Lighter alloys, improved plate configurations, and better-fitting vests made them more comfortable for long missions. Pilots reported being able to move more freely, while gunners, who faced the highest risk of injury, benefited from better lower body protection. Colonel Gross' efforts had by then attracted the attention of senior Allied command. General Carl Spaatz and General Jimmy Doolittle both personally commended him for his contributions, recognizing that the armor program had saved thousands of lives. Gross continued to refine his designs even after the initial models entered service. Working with the U.S. Army Air Force's medical research divisions, he tested new materials, including aluminum and various composite fabrics, searching for ways to improve flexibility without reducing protection. By the time of the Normandy invasion in June 1944, flak armor had become as much a part of bomber gear as oxygen masks and flak helmets. It was no longer an experimental idea, it was a standard, essential component of aircrew survival. Statistics collected throughout 1944 confirmed its life-saving role. Reports from the Air Surgeon's Office showed a steady decline in fatal torso wounds, even as bombing missions grew more frequent and more dangerous. Commanders across the European theater acknowledged that Gross' innovation was one of the few defenses airmen had against the brutal realities of high-altitude combat. The psychological effect was equally important. Crews who wore the armor felt noticeably more secure. While it couldn't guarantee safety, the sense of protection improved morale and confidence during missions where fear of flak had become overwhelming. By the war's end in 1945, over 300,000 sets of flak armor had been produced for the U.S. Army Air Forces alone. It had transformed from a small field experiment in North Africa into a fully standardized system adopted across Allied air operations. When Colonel Gross was later interviewed about his invention, he emphasized that the armor's success was due not to a single discovery, but to collaboration between medicine, metallurgy, and the courage of the airmen who tested it in combat. It was a matter, he said, of applying common sense and science to save lives that might otherwise have been lost. His words carried quiet humility, yet few wartime innovations had saved more Allied airmen than the armor he helped design. When World War II ended in 1945, the contribution of Colonel Malcolm C. Gross and his flak armor program stood among the most significant achievements in aircrew safety. Though overshadowed by more famous wartime technologies, such as radar or jet propulsion, Gross' innovation directly saved countless lives. The concept of practical, wearable protection for combat personnel had proven itself beyond dispute. After the war, the U.S. Army Air Forces continued to study and refine Gross' designs. His work laid the foundation for a new generation of body armor suited not only for aviators but also for soldiers on the ground. The experience gained during bomber missions provided invaluable data on how to balance weight, mobility, and protection. In 1947, when the U.S. Air Force became a separate branch of the military, Gross was appointed as its first Surgeon General. In that role, he oversaw major advancements in aviation medicine, ranging from high-altitude physiology to survival gear for jet pilots. The lessons learned from his wartime research on flak armor continued to influence his medical and technical policies throughout the emerging Cold War. Meanwhile, the principle of fragment-resistant protection spread rapidly through all branches of the armed forces. The Korean War saw the reintroduction of flexible body armor for infantrymen, incorporating lightweight aluminum and nylon materials that had evolved directly from gross original concepts. By the time of the Vietnam War, modern composite fibers like Kevlar would take the idea even further, reducing weight while improving ballistic resistance. In this way, every soldier who later donned a flak jacket, whether in Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, or Afghanistan, owed something to Gross' pioneering work during the dark years of World War II. His approach demonstrated that saving lives could depend as much on medical innovation as on tactical strategy or weapon design. Colonel Gross' post-war career was distinguished. In recognition of his achievements, he was promoted to Major General and awarded the Distinguished Service Medal for his exceptional vision and leadership in the protection of Air Force personnel. He retired in 1949, leaving behind a legacy defined not by destruction, but by preservation of life. In the decades that followed, historians and military medical experts continued to credit Gross for initiating the world's first successful combat body armor program. His collaboration with Wilkinson Sword, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and the U.S. Army Air Force's Medical Corps remains one of the most remarkable examples of interdisciplinary problem-solving in wartime history. Today, surviving examples of his World War II-era flak vests are displayed in museums across the United States and the United Kingdom. Each vest tells a silent story of the men who wore them, many of whom returned home because of Gross' determination to find a better way. The philosophy behind his work continues to resonate, that the most effective innovations in warfare are often those that protect life rather than take it. The steel plates of the 1940s may have long been replaced by synthetic fibers and advanced ceramics, but the underlying principle remains unchanged. In the words of one 8th Air Force veteran interviewed years later, "That vest didn't make you fearless, but it made you believe you might make it home." For those who survived the flak-filled skies of Europe, that belief and the armor that gave it was a legacy no less heroic than any victory won in battle.